for joining us. I did it that time. Pardon me. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you again for joining us in this last day of our 2022 AGM and conference. It's been a great event so far. Je tiens à souhaiter la bienvenue à tous nos membres de partout à travers le Canada. I think it's important that we do have members, almost 300 members from across the country listening in this week. Today, we're going to wrap up our week with an in-depth discussion on the issues that impact you most. Labor and skills. The issue has been raised through the week. On Tuesday, we released the results of our most recent survey, 560 companies across Canada, talking about how shortages are hurting them and the economy. 80% are facing labor shortages. Incredible that it has been rising and stayed steady since 2020 when it was at 60% and only 30% back in 2016. So that ongoing challenge has a cost, and that cost is economic loss. The economic loss in the manufacturing sector from lost sales, from penalties related to delivery of product, to postponement of capital investments. So those shortages are constraining our growth as a sector, and we need more workers. So that's really important. We are active on this front. It has to come from immigration. It has to come from outreach to underrepresented groups. We have to get more youth into our sector. And you, as our members across the country, we're counting on you, but we'll do our part as well, because we're calling on the governments to support automation, increased immigration, reforms immigration to help alleviate backlogs, employee-led training benefits. We want to encourage more people to join our great sector. Now, we're kicking off our discussion about ESG, because many of you have heard those letters. You see it in a lot of business reports. But what does it mean? What does environment, social, and governance framework, what does it mean for you as manufacturers? It's rapidly become one of the top priorities for Canadian manufacturers and exporters. So in a moment, we'll learn from CME's Véronique Proulx and Hélène Gagnon, Chief Sustainability Officer and SVP Stakeholder Engagement at CAE, on what opportunities and challenges ESG presents for manufacturers. And then we're going to have a panel discussion led by Julie Rubin-Rodney, founder and CEO of Max People, with panelists from Protocase, from ADS Automation, and Point Canada to dive into the S of ESG and to share best practices to help you attract and retain and upskill your workforce. So this is really how we can help you and how we can help each other and how we can help the country get us back on the right track, especially in terms of this most important resource that we all have, which is our workforce. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Véronique. Thank you very much, and I'll catch up with you all later on at the end of the program.
Thank you, Dennis. So I'll ask Helen to join me. Good afternoon, Helen.
Hello.
I'm so pleased you accepted our invitation to discuss this important topic about ESG in manufacturing, but more specifically within CAE. So we have more or less 30 minutes, 35 minutes to discuss this. I have many questions for you, so I'll go ahead, I'll jump in. You've been recently named as Chief Sustainability Officer in addition to your role as SVP and engagement at CAE. So congratulations, first thing. Very long title, but for big responsibilities as well. What does your new role involve in terms of responsibilities and scope? And what changes have you put in place within your company?
Well, thank you so much, Véronique, and thanks for having me. I just wanted to say first, congratulations to you, Dennis, and the whole CME team. What you're doing is so important for Canadian businesses. I was on the board of CME Quebec way back, 15 years ago already. But of course, I've been following everything that you've been doing since. So congratulations. And before I maybe answer your question, just for everyone's benefit, just want to say a few words about CAE. So we are there. We're a high-tech company to make that makes the world safer with our simulation-based training in 3 businesses: civil aviation, defense and security, and even healthcare. And maybe a fun fact, anywhere you travel in the world, there's more than 80% chances that the pilot was trained on a flight simulator that was designed and built in Montreal by CAE or at one of our training centers around the world. And of course, we export our first flight simulators around the world. So definitely a good Canadian manufacturer and exporter, and that fits right in, for your membership. So you asked me about my new role, and it's not about me. I think for people really listening to us, I think I'm just going to use this as an illustration of our journey in terms of ESG, because I'm sure that everyone is kind of wondering, what should we be doing and at what pace. So the reality is that when I joined CAE almost 8 years ago, we had not started our ESG journey at all. We were not structured. We had no report. So I joined more as the SVP of Public Affairs and Global Communications, and I basically asked that we throw in corporate social responsibility. And I started to structure our approach, but nobody was doing this on a full-time basis. Not an executive, not a team, nobody. And it's just recently that basically this year, I asked that my role evolved to become the Chief Sustainability Officer and SVP Stakeholder Engagement, because I said we need to have someone at the management level, senior management in the C-suite, that will spend more time on this, and we need a team that will be dedicated. So in terms of responsibility, and I have a team for ESG strategy and reporting. We've appointed a chief diversity and equity and inclusion officer. I have the environment climate change team, very small team as well. They've thrown in R&D support in the aerospace, very important to us, and all the university relations, and I'm still accountable for public affairs and global communications. But the point is that even if we are a multinational, until very recently, we had nobody taking, charge of ESG on a full-time basis. And we were able to manage because everything was still on a voluntary basis up until very recently. But I must admit that in the last 18 months, really during COVID, everything has been accelerating. And when I mean everything, I mean the attention and the pressure coming from the various stakeholders. And capital markets and investors have been really at the forefront. So we used to get, maybe a question once in a while from investors about ESG, but now we do get those questions every week. Same thing from customers. It was, something that customers were discussing. Now we see in our RFPs, the whole sections around ESG. So it's been so important that now we have a team. But for people, listening to us and wondering, saying, well, we haven't started, or we don't have anybody. Well, even a multinational had no, kind of full-time team until very recently. But now I think it's a good time to start thinking, okay, well, how fast, how far should I go, depending on the pressure that you're feeling from your customers, and eventually the one that you will want to put on your suppliers. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss that in the next few minutes.
Absolutely. So clearly you gave yourself the resources and the team to be able to roll out your strategy and your plan. So very interesting. Now, what do you see as the main benefits of a strong ESG performance for a company?
Well, it's interesting that you ask about the benefits, and I like that, because very often when people start thinking about ESG, people think about the risk, and there's a lot of risk around ESG, but I'm glad that we're discussing benefits and opportunities, because you really need to approach this with these two lenses, and the opportunity size is very important. And I understand you'll have another panel on talent attraction and retention, but I would say that the first benefit of having a strong ESG program and reporting is around talent attraction and retention. So really, there's a lot of studies that demonstrate that today employees are basically picking and choosing which companies they work for, depending on the purpose of the company, depending on how responsible the company is. I can tell you that in interviews, we get asked so many questions around ESG these days. And during COVID, when we were really active to help society with, building and inventing a ventilator, and then leading a vaccination campaign through companies in Quebec, it had a huge impact on employee engagement. So I think the first, big benefit is around employee attraction, retention, goodwill, engagement. And it's very, very important in the market that we live in with the labor shortage. It could be a real differentiator for you as a company. The second benefit is around, I would say, competitive advantage with your customers. And really, when I said, earlier that we're seeing more attention from customers, no matter what areas you work in, whether you're consumer facing or B2B, we're more of a B2B company. We feel it now. We feel it from governments, even in defense procurements. We see it all over the world that governments are asking a lot of questions around ESG and especially around the E on environment, and it's good because simulation-based training is actually really good from a carbon footprint. 1 minute in a fighter jet equals 1 full day in a full flight simulator. So simulation-based training can really be part of the solution to reduce carbon footprint. But I think that's the second benefit. It's really your competitive advantage with your customers. The third one is access to new types of financing. And really, there are types of financing out there: ESG funds, ESG bonds, sustainability funds, sustainability bonds. So if you are ready to make some significant commitments, and if you see them through, you'll have access to new types of funding, and that's also been accelerated and a lot more open in the last year, I would say. So that's another benefit. And the last one is, with my communications background, I have to say it, but definitely it plays a significant role in building your reputation and your profile everywhere with all of your stakeholders. So not to be underestimated. But there are, of course, a number of other benefits, but I say that maybe these would be my top 4.
Well, they're very good benefits. A lot of SMEs are listening to us today, and labor shortages, as you mentioned, and as we revealed earlier this week in our survey, is the number one issue. And manufacturers are losing a lot of money and a lot of opportunities because of labor shortages. So interesting to see that ESG can be a way to attract and retain employees. And we'll go into D&I a little later on in those questions. Okay, but more specifically now, you have become the first aerospace company in Canada to be worldwide carbon neutral, correct? What does that mean, and what challenges did you encounter?
Well, maybe I can explain, how this happened, because it's actually very interesting. We actually made that commitment before the pandemic at the fall of 2019. If you recall, at the time there were big demonstrations around the world and in various cities across Canada. A lot of our youth were marching in the cities asking for actions on climate change, and there was a big march demonstration right here in Montreal. And the kids of our CEO were in that demonstration. My son was there as well. But anyway, the kids of our CEO called him that night and said, "You're a CEO. You're a CEO of a good company. You're doing good, on the environment. But what else could you do? What else could you do to inspire others? How far, you should go further and be an inspiration to others." And so Marc Parent called me and he said, "Okay, what is it that we could do? I want us to be bold. I want us to inspire. I want us to do something bigger for the environment, because they're right. We have a role to play, and climate change is not just for the others. It's not just for countries. It's not just for individuals, but we as corporations have to do something. And I want to do something now." So we regrouped and we said, okay, well, why don't we make a commitment to become carbon neutral? So becoming carbon neutral means basically trying to reduce as much as you can your carbon footprint, especially scope 1 and scope 2, so your direct emissions, and scope 2 is your electricity that you use in all of your sites, and then you have to compensate the residual emissions. So we said, why don't we make the commitment to become carbon neutral in the next year? So we did that in the fall of 2019, and then a few months later, the pandemic hit, and our market in civil aviation collapsed. From one day to the next, there was no more, air passenger traffic, and it was very, very hard for us. And I'm sure, if we had told our stakeholders, look, we're going to push that commitment to the right, because the world has collapsed upon us, I don't think, the stakeholders would have told us, you weren't serious. But on the contrary, we said, okay, we made that commitment for the right reason, because we want to make a difference for the planet and really show that we're serious about climate change. So within a year, in September 2020, we actually became carbon neutral. So it means that we had to invest to compensate our residual emissions for Scope 1 and Scope 2. And we've also thrown in the air business travel of our employees, because that's our industry. So it's part of our indirect emissions, part of Scope 3. And what that actually did for us, it's that it created what we call a built-in incentive to actually continue to reduce at the source, because nobody is forcing us to be carbon neutral right now. A lot of companies are making commitments, and they're making it in the very long term, saying we're going to try to reduce our footprint by 2030, 2040, 2050. But what we did is that, no, we're serious. We're going to take action right now. And we're getting an invoice for compensation with carbon offsets and the renewable energy certificates for all of our 200 sites in 35 countries every year. So what that does, and of course I can tell you that business units and the finance people, they don't like to see that invoice coming in, for compensation. But it forces everybody to say, okay, well, what do we do to reduce that? What do we do to reduce at the source? And so we're forcing ourselves basically to be even more active to reduce our carbon footprint. And that's why this summer we announced that we're going to convert part of our own fleet of aircraft, because we do own very small aircraft, to give the initial training pilot license to cadets in some countries, 200 aircraft, and we're going to convert part of that fleet into electric aircraft. Very realistic to do that in the next few years, because we do, an hour flight for like 2 people in these small aircraft. So it's actually realistic to do that. So that's going to reduce our footprint. So I think we've succeeded by doing that, in demonstrating to other companies, whether in aerospace or in other sectors, that you can take some actions right now. You can force yourself to go further and not wait for regulation to force you to reduce your footprint. And by doing so, the goodwill that we got, from our employees, in particular, that are so proud that we are carbon neutral and that we're leading the charge on climate action, is unbelievable. And I think you should not underestimate that. Of course, you're doing it for the climate, but you're also doing it to energize, other companies, energize your employees, and it's really making a difference. Not to make those commitments too far away in time, and just to say we're going to take some actions right now. So we still have challenges, because it's not fun to pay for compensation, but at least I think we're doing it for the right reason. And of course, some of the challenges for us is to actually get the right data all over the world. You can imagine that some of our sites, when we have 200 sites in 35 countries, to get the energy of that site, to make sure we have the right data, to it's not necessarily easy. So we're still struggling, to make sure that we have the right data available. But I think it's been a good process for us.
And Helen, just to go back, how long you said you started in 2000?
Yeah, we made the commitment in 2019. We became
Okay.
carbon neutral in 2020. So we've been carbon neutral now for 3 years in a row, in 2020, 2021, 2022.
And how would you say that the employees have adapted to this? You were saying there was some resistance, or they weren't happy when they saw the invoices, for example. How is it now today?
Well, I think the employees at large, they're very positive. There's no resistance. I think the resistance comes from the finance people,
Okay.
and my finance colleagues, and as they should, because when you're wondering, nobody's forcing you to actually pay this compensation. So why are we doing this? And it's their job, to question this and to rally around this this action, to say this is important. This is what our stakeholders are expecting from us. This is what investors want to see, some serious actions reducing the climate. So of course there's still resistance, but it's good resistance. It's a built-in incentive to force us to take action. So we have some good conversations, but I think everyone's aligned with the objective now.
Fantastic, fantastic. My next question is on diversity and inclusion. Now, within CME, we've launched Women in Manufacturing, which the objective is to increase the presence of women at all levels in manufacturing companies. And we've been very strong on this, and we've been talking a lot about diversity and inclusion. So I would like to hear you, because I've heard you speak on other panels of measures you've been putting in place, and I found them to be really interesting and relevant for those who are listening to us. So can you tell us a bit of what you're doing and perhaps a few specific examples of how you're doing it?
So again, when I said we had not started on the ESG journey 8 years ago, we had not started on the structured diversity journey about, I think we started now 5 years ago. And the first place to start is that you should really kind of have a committee at the top, to determine what you're going to do and how you're going to go about it, whether you're going to give yourself some targets and things like that. So that's really where you should start, and it starts with the tone at the top. But some of the things that we have done that really had an impact, especially on gender, because we really started around gender. The aerospace is a male-dominated industry, like many other manufacturing industries that we have, and we started to look at the talent that we have in house. So we have a process whereby every year we do a talent review, and we look at the high potential, and we give them visibility with the executive. And when we started that process, when I joined, there was almost no women that were featured in that process. And it was not because my colleagues were against women. That's not, what it was. It was that they were just hidden, if I may call it that way. When we decided to say, well, in that process, we need to feature at least 30 to 40% of women. My colleagues had to first go dig deeper in the organization to say, okay, well, if we don't have, vice president and directors and managers, who are the women that, we could be featuring? And all of a sudden, we started to find all these amazing women that had not the right visibility, that were not, giving opportunities to the potential that they had. And just by starting to feature more women, give them more high visibility projects, all of a sudden, their career has really kind of skyrocketed. And it's not a question of promoting women against men. That's not what it is. And no women, not you, not me, would ever want to be promoted because they're a woman. That's, the last thing you need to do. But you have at some point to give the same opportunities to be considered. And at some point, things are happening by themselves when you have the same visibility, that you focus on the development of your women, and you give them more support to actually grow. And in our case, it's really had, an amazing impact. And just as I was appointed the Chief Sustainability Officer this year, we appointed a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer this year as well. It was part of the team that we wanted to have to increase our focus. But again, we did not have anyone in charge until very recently in terms of a team. But if you want to make some real progress, then you need, again, to focus some resources. And gender is one aspect, but of course, it's only one aspect of diversity. And sometimes for companies, it's hard to know where to start and what to do and what actions you need to take to really increase diversity. And one of the ways to do it is to create what we call the ERGs, or the employee resource groups, that are employee led. You give them a budget. You encourage them to create those groups depending on their affinities. So we have one group for the LGBTQ plus community. We have one group for people from different ethnic background. We have an Indigenous ERGs. We have more than one on women in aviation, women in technical. We have one for parents with kids with special needs, and employees with various disabilities. And basically, these ERGs act as sounding boards for your management, but also they drive the change by themselves. And they tell you what they need. They tell you what is lacking to help them grow in the company. They help you foster a more inclusive culture, because sometimes if we are not from a diverse background, sometimes we don't even realize some of the issues that the various underrepresented group face, microaggressions and all of these. Sometimes people, they don't realize, even that there's a culture of microaggressions coming or developing in some areas. And so these groups are employee-led, and they really make a difference. So for us, these ERGs, we have 8 now, and they're really making a big difference for us. So these are some of the ideas I would say that when you want to start on a journey for diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are things that that you could do. Oh, and maybe one more example that I could give. When we do the talent review, um, in the various department, we have created a kind of a little guide, and we appoint one person that we call the bias interrupter. And that person, during the talent conversation, has as one of its mandate to say, when a conversation goes a certain way, to say, bias interrupter, I think, what we're doing here and the way the conversation is going is we have kind of an unconscious bias, and we should just take stock of what's going on, and maybe we should rephrase or, restart this conversation another way. So this is new, this is something that we've been incorporated in our conversation, and it helps, because sometimes, as we say, we all have unconscious bias, and when we realize what we have, then it's actually be helpful to overcome them.
So you're sharing a lot of tricks and best practices on D&I with us. Is this something you developed internally? Did you get external support to be able to develop these ways of doing?
Well, when we started, we did a benchmark and sessions with Catalyst. I think Catalyst is well known in Canada, but there is a group with the UN Global Compact they've developed, and we've contributed to their kind of guidebook on diversity for gender. Maybe we could share, the link of that guide. There's a lot of companies that contributed, that it basically a kind of a how-to guide, where to start, what to do, in what order, how to involve people. So there's a lot of resources that are available out there that are not necessarily consultants or things that you need to pay
Yeah.
for or things like that. And you could actually have access to these types of guides that will actually help you. And you take these things and you, of course, adapt them to your reality, depending on how big or how small your company is, to make sure it fits in your culture and your company. But I think there's some really good resources out there, and I'm thinking of that UN Global Compact one. That is a really good one.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing. And actually, that's something we could share in our follow-up email to
Yeah.
all the attendees. As well, within CME, I was referring to women in manufacturing. We have developed some toolkits in different provinces. We have some support that's being offered. I'm thinking of in Alberta, but also in Quebec. So we'll make sure to share that with all of the group afterwards. Okay, so it brings us to suppliers. Now, large corporations such as yourselves have been taking different level of leaderships in terms of implementing ESG objectives. But I think the real concern is, how do we bring our supply chain, and therefore our SMEs, to start getting in the process and to comply eventually? So how is CAE working with its suppliers? You have suppliers all over Canada?
Yes, absolutely, in every province, and we're very proud of that. But and we do have some suppliers all over the world as well. And you're so right, Veronique, that the level of maturity of companies around ESG varies a lot right now. And it's very understandable. I mean, we have so many issues on our table. Sometimes, companies will say, well, is this urgent? Do I need to look at this now, or can I, push that to the right a little bit? But I think, the reason we're having this conversation now is that ESG is really accelerating. And although, you know, some companies listening to us might not be as mature as others, it is kind of time to start thinking about, you know, what is your carbon footprint? What are you doing around, you know, your governance? You know, are you looking at your own supply chain to make sure there's a lot of compliance in there on, you know, human rights? We're not concerned, you know, of course, in Canada to say, are we respecting human rights directly? But in the supply chain, when we use some low-cost countries, we might get some surprises, and it might resurface at a time that you won't want to. And I think it's very important that we start looking at all of this. So what we're doing with our suppliers is, first we need to accompany them and engage them in the whole ESG journey. And I'm sure if you are a supplier to larger corporation, you've probably started to receive, you know, codes of conducts. Make sure that you respect the various codes of conducts of the large companies, but also you're going to be asked, you know, what is your carbon footprint? Where is your material coming from? Who are your tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers, your own suppliers? Because at some point, you know, especially when you're thinking about climate change, everybody's intertwined. So when we have to look at our scope 3 emissions, so our indirect emissions coming from our value chain, well, somebody else's our scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1. So everybody is kind of intertwined. And eventually, you know, as companies mature like ourselves, we're in the process now of getting a good understanding of our own scope 3. So the carbon from our own value chain, we're going to have to ask and have a lot of conversation with a lot of our suppliers, when some of our suppliers don't even know what their carbon footprint is. So we will need to be there and help them determine what's the footprint before we even start to have the conversation of, you know, how can we reduce your footprint, you know? But some companies will go faster than others. So first, what we started to do is to have some webinars with our various suppliers. So we had webinars on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because of course we want to increase the diversity in our supply chain, have more women-owned companies, Indigenous-owned companies. Various certifications are available for companies. So we started to have that conversation, awareness, and education with our suppliers. And in about, I think, 2 weeks, we'll have another webinar, this time on carbon footprint, to start to have that conversation. Also, what we're thinking of doing and in the process of developing is to have a program to recognize our suppliers. We want to do business with suppliers that share our values in terms of ESG, but it's not always by saying, you know, you're not compliant and it's not good, then, you know, you're not going to have a contract with us, that you're going to move things. Sometimes it's by recognizing suppliers. So we're going to have some awards and prizes for the various suppliers that are the most aligned with our values. So that's also some elements to inspire some of our suppliers, to help them understand, you know, what we would like them to do in terms of ESG.
And how do you, I find that, you know, we speak with a lot of SMEs, manufacturers across Quebec, across Canada, and often when we talk about ESG, we realize that they're not necessarily very much aware of what that means and what they need to do, or how fast it's coming. What is your experience with your suppliers? Is it similar, and how do you overcome that?
Yeah, I think, and that's what I mean by the level of maturity. You know, sometimes when we start having the conversation with some suppliers, and they don't even know what ESG means. You know, what do you mean ESG? They've heard maybe social responsibility, but they're thinking this is just voluntary. They don't need to really take care of that right now. But I think it's all part of the conversation. So the fact that we have a code of conduct and that we're asking all the suppliers to sign the code of conduct is one way to start that awareness. The fact that now now ESG are part of the decision criteria in how we award a contract is, of course, another way to have a conversation. The fact that we'll have this recognition program is another way. So I think there's not kind of one size fits all. And of course, in our supply chain, we have companies that are more mature than us. And I'm not saying, and I'm sharing all of this with a lot of humility, you know, today. We're far from being perfect on the ESG journey. The bar keeps rising every year on the market, and we're not, you know, at the top of every indices by far, but we want to, and we're putting a lot of attention to improving. But I think it's going to be a journey for a lot of companies, and at some point we'll be as strong as our supply chain can be, and therefore it's going to be our job as the large corporation to help the smaller companies to actually come with us on this journey, because we'll all be stronger by doing it.
I'm going to ask an additional question in relation to this. We've been talking a lot with supply chain disruptions. We've been talking about supply chain resiliency. How do we increase our resiliency to be less affected by everything that's been affecting us over the past 2 years? Is ESG a way to increase that resiliency?
Yes, and one of the, and I've been talking a lot about the E up until now on the carbon footprint aspect, but another aspect of the E of ESG is what we called adaptation to climate change. And when we think about adaptation, that's a lot around the resilience. So when we think about adaptation to climate change, it means thinking about everything that is that could happen to your site with extreme climate scenarios, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods. I mean, all these things that even in Canada looked really remote to us even a few years ago. And now every year, 2-3 times a year, we have been experiencing those extreme climate scenarios in various parts of the countries. And therefore, of course, that impacted a lot of companies. And so when you look at your ESG journey, one aspect will be to build your resilience on that aspect of adapting to climate change. And I think that's another element that right now people are maybe looking at it on the business continuity label or enterprise risk management label, but you can consider it and put it in the E of the ESG, because everything that I'm talking about now, whether it's adaptation to climate change to build your resiliency of your supply chain or your carbon footprint, will become a regulation in the not too distant future. We know that it's coming in the US and being discussed right now in Canada, and all of these things will become mandatory, and you'll have to disclose that publicly, especially if you're a company that is traded on the stock exchange. And if you are on the stock exchange, then you'll have to get the data from the smaller companies so that you can disclose. So all of this will accelerate, I would say, in the next probably year and a half.
Excellent, thank you. So I have one last final question, and I'm glad I put it in, because all through this conversation, if there's one thing that really that I really keep in mind is leadership. CAE is clearly a strong leader in Canada, but worldwide in terms of ESG, and you are a strong leader as well in terms of pushing the company to go ahead with this, putting in place strategies, plan, and really making it a real commitment that means something. So if in 5 or 10 years from now, when you look back, what do you think Canadian manufacturers should have achieved or to contribute to a sustainable economy?
Well, maybe I'll go not that far at first. And I think with everything that I've been sharing today around the acceleration of, the stakeholder expectations, potential regulation right around the corner, I think I would hope that in the next 2-3 years, all the companies in Canada are able to really have a good inventory of their own carbon footprint. Because right now, I don't think all the companies that are listening to us do have that. And I think it's going to be important because you'll be asked to share with your customers, with your suppliers, eventually even publicly, through regulation for mandatory climate disclosures. So I would say that even before thinking of 5 to 10 years, I'm hoping that after this conversation, a lot of people will say, well, maybe we should get going on at least having a good inventory of our carbon footprint, because that's the first step. If you have an inventory, then you can have a look and start setting some targets to say, well, how can we reduce? How can we work with others in the ecosystem and contribute to reducing our carbon at the source? Everybody will need to play a role if we want to counter the impact of climate change. Not just the individuals, not just the government, not just the provincial governments, but the companies as well. So the first place to start is do your inventory and, start looking at how you can reduce. So hopefully, doing an inventory and looking at targets and then reducing, progressively and seeing some real reductions starting at least in the next 5 years, and hopefully we'll have some more significant reductions in the next 10 years. I think that would be one area where I'm very hopeful that we can transition together. The second area is around looking really at the impact of your exposure to human rights risk. And I think across the life cycle of your products, the fact that we may all have, suppliers in various countries, we need to be very sensitive and very solidary to make sure that we protect human rights. And that's an extension of what we do. So again, I would say first understanding, the risk, and then progressively, within the next 5 to 10 years, pushing the envelope a little further, doing some audits and making sure that you are implementing and making sure you really understand the potential exposure that you might have on human rights risk. Hopefully, I think companies will have made some great strides on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we've seen just in the last 2-3 years, the conversation about around Indigenous rights has been taking a lot more space in Canada, and I think in the boardrooms across Canada as well. So hopefully we'll do a lot of improvement in terms of improving our representation in our workplace of the various underrepresented groups, whether women, LGBTQ, Indigenous, people from various ethnic backgrounds, making sure that all of these groups are more and more in senior positions and on the boards of directors of the various companies around the country. I think, I'm also sitting on a number of boards. Just 5 years ago, this conversation around diversity was not really happening, and now every time we have conversation around that, and I'm now on boards where there's parity, which was almost unthinkable just a few years back. So hopefully there's going to be a lot more representation of the underrepresented groups through all the actions that everybody will do in the next few years, so that in 5 to 10 years our boardrooms and companies will be representative of the whole population. So these are elements that, I hope we can make some progress together in the next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. I hope so too. Alan, we've been very efficient. It brings us to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for having taken this time with us and having shared with us what ESG means to the company, to CAE, to you, and having shared the best practices. And hopefully, as you mentioned, I'm sure it will have increased the level of awareness of members who are listening and give them the will to go forward and start putting some changes in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Véronique.
So now we will continue with our next panel, and I'll hand it over to Julie Rubin-Rodney, who's founder and CEO of Max People. Max People has been a valued partner for a sponsor of CME for now 5 years. Thank you so much, Julie, for being with us.
And thank you for that fabulous fireside chat. There were a lot of topics that were covered that we are going to keep building on. The purpose of our panel now is to really dive into practical examples from our wonderful panelists. And I want to first just invite them to the panel now, meaning turn on your cameras. And Shawnee McNeil is the R&D manager from Protocase. She is a fellow Maritimer, so it was great to meet her, and maybe she can wave out so the group can see who she is, and she'll be involved in our panel today, as well as Simon Drexler, who is the general manager of the products group for ATS Automation, and I was thrilled to see him face to face earlier this week. It was nice to see people live, wasn't it? It was great. And Kathleen Garney, general manager of Boeing Canada, and I know you had a colleague there as well who I got to meet, which was really great. So thank you all for being here today. I want to start at a very high level because we want to get really practical examples from all of you. And we know the topic is current labor and skills challenges. And we want to look at it from different areas, different industries, regionally. So really looking at your organizations from more of a broad viewpoint. And we saw in the recent survey that just came out from CME that 82% have experienced labor shortages. So we don't have a lot of people who have probably signed into this who are not experiencing this. The number's pretty high. And as you heard, Max People is a HR employment law firm, and our HR consultants are hearing it every day and working with our clients to try to figure this out. And we all have to get creative and help each other in this area. So I want to ask, and the first person I'm going to ask is Shonid, so she's ready in there. What are the current labor and skills challenges you are observing in your organization and your supply chain partners as well? So both your organization and a lot we've been hearing over and over again, it's also that comes from the supply chain that's impacting us. And how's that affecting your operations directly or indirectly? So again, I will start with you.
Thank you, Julie. So right now, one of the biggest challenges we face is recruiting the specific talent that we need in a few different areas. So overall, I mean, we're not experiencing labor shortage across the board in all positions at our company, but some of the areas where we have been hit the hardest include software development, because right now the market is so it's so hardwired to allow people to work remotely. And so when we have a position in Nova Scotia that requires you to be in Nova Scotia and not in Halifax at that, in Sydney, Nova Scotia, due to the nature of the work, we do require software developers to very much integrate with our operations on the floor. So they need to kind of be in it in order to do the job. It's not like, you know, any other software development role where you could work from wherever. Then we're competing with salaries, you know, in Toronto, in Montreal and Vancouver, and, you know, elsewhere in the world. So it's become a very specific challenge for us to be able to recruit and retain talent in that area. Another area is in our engineering department. It's a little bit less intense because normally engineers, we hire mainly mechanical and industrial engineers. They are more they do anticipate that they'll have to work on site, but still we are competing with the rest of the country. And so when there is such a high demand for that type of work, we face the same issues as everyone else. So in order to thwart that, we try to offer a very unique value proposition in our company culture. So that's one way that we attempt to attract and retain talent. And, you know, the other issue that we're having in the production floor is just simply the massive numbers of people that we're required to hire in order to maintain our growth. Right. At a certain point in time, we anticipate that we might run out of laborers in this area. So I think it was mentioned earlier that, you know, it is something that we're looking at expanding outside of Nova Scotia and maybe even outside of Canada in order to overcome that challenge. We're not quite there yet, but it is something that's on our radar, let's say.
Okay.
And the second half of the question, sorry, was about supply chain issues as
absolutely.
well.
Are you finding that they're having these current labor and skill shortages that are then impacting your business?
Yeah, we were certainly experiencing issues with our supply chain over the last, let's say, 2 years. We haven't felt dramatic impacts from that. I mean, we track our on time at a weekly level, and we did have some significant dips sort of earlier in the pandemic, but we haven't really been impacted tremendously by that. So we're lucky in that sense.
Excellent. And thank you for sharing that. We're going to keep diving into questions around attracting talent in the future of work. So that was a good build where we're going to go. Just want to throw it over to Simon, and just to build on that as well, and telling us what are your current labor and skills challenges that you've been observing at ATS, and also your supply chain, and generally how it's really impacting your operations directly or indirectly.
Thank you, Julie. I have maybe an interesting perspective on this because I get hit both sides of this. So I'm an automation provider. So those that are having labor shortages are coming to seek automation, which is significantly increasing demand for what we offer. That's a great thing. But then I also operate a reasonably sized operation here in Canada, which is experiencing labor shortages for production because we produce a lot of our technology here in Canada. So I get the collision of the two vectors myself. We are struggling, very similar to what Sinead said, at the programming level, looking for automation integrators and PLC programmers. So that is a challenge for us, but we are still challenged for manufacturing resources. And what that's done for us is shifted our focus to two places. We've spent a significant amount of time with lean initiatives in trying to improve our own efficiency, because even as a world-leading automation company, there are many things that we can't automate still. And what we're doing is trying to find interesting ways to just improve our own efficiencies. So we've invested in lean resources, lean training, a lot of process mapping and bottleneck searching to try to just make us as efficient as we can as we continue to grow and struggle on the labor side of the world. And then the other thing that we do is we turn to technology. And we've been trying to augment our workforce, collaborative robotics, basically anything that can help improve ourselves even a little bit over the course of this time where we're struggling with labor. So those would be the two things.
So I mean, like, you've got the upside of it. People are coming to you because of those skill shortages, that they're thinking, can we automate this? And so, like you said, you're getting both sides of the equation based on what your organization does. So
it's a bit of a vicious cycle, because more people are coming to me to help them, which creates a larger problem for me to build the technology.
It sounds like our world in HR,
Yeah, and from a supply chain perspective, we actually, again, very similar to Sinead, we for the last couple of years, I would say we've seen a positive trend, and we thought we were sort of over the hump. And then in the last 3 months, we've really started to see some of our sub-suppliers get impacted by COVID again.
Right.
And so they're starting to have increasing absenteeism. They're starting to have issues with finding labor. So I think that stability is starting to fall out inside at least the local market, which our activity now is to start looking to mitigate our supply risks. And we're looking to vary our supply base. We're looking outside of the local region, especially for critical components, so that we have dual source.
Absolutely. We heard that a little bit earlier in the week. People are really rethinking their businesses and making sure their supply chain, they're not, all eggs are not in one basket, and you have a number of places to go. Absolutely. And then Kathleen.
That's exactly.
Yeah. And Kathleen, tell us from your perspective from Boeing, what are the current challenges you're experiencing, just on a broad way, and then we'll dive a little deeper.
Sure. I think in the Broadway current challenges, we're a manufacturing company, and so we have to have people on site in order to do many, if not all, of the roles that we have. There's some flexibility in terms of the amount of time that they need to be on site, but so we just kind of lean into that and accept that as a constraint and be very transparent, with those that we're either engaging if we're trying to retain existing talent and or attract new talent, because it's something that we can't change. And so I'd say that's kind of where we're focused on saying, okay, well, is the pie getting smaller? And so if it is, how do we position ourselves so we get a bigger slice of that pie? What are we offering in terms of benefits, pay, engagement activities, some of the soft things that are difficult to quantify. What's it like to work here at Boeing Canada Winnipeg?
Mhm.
And then we're thinking about how we can make the pie bigger. What I'll call it force or stress do we need to apply to local, provincial, federal governments in order to say, how do we create great larger pathways for people to walk down so that they can enter the manufacturing industry?
Mhm. Actually, and thank you. I appreciate the description of making the pie bigger, right? And we're going to explore that a little bit today, because that's one of the challenges we're looking at in manufacturing is like, how do we bring more people into the pie? But let's take a step back for a moment, just talk about attracting and retaining. And each of you have touched on it a little bit. And I can do a pitch for why you'd want to live in Nova Scotia if you want, and with the beautiful lands and stuff, or in Winnipeg, or right here in Cambridge. But, really attracting our talent. And so attracting, developing, and retaining talent to ensure your organization has the critical skills you need and into the future. We need that for sustainable operations, for competitive advantage. And given the pandemic, which Simon already mentioned, it feels like the waves just keep coming. So you feel like you're over the hump, and then we're back at it again. But for us, we want to ask that very specific question around what are you doing to attract and retain talent? And so I'm going to start with you, Simon, around what are the current strategies you're doing to attract and retain your talent currently? And I also want to ask specifically around, the untapped areas, and we talked about it earlier in the fireside chat, like women, visible minorities, underrepresented groups, LGBTQI2 spirited, or other untapped groups. So what are you doing again to both attract talent, and then once we get them, let's retain them? I'll start with you, Simon.
Yeah, I had a fairly prepared answer for this that changed in the last 24 hours, because I heard something that I thought was very relevant. We were actually in the midst of moving our facility, and one of the partners that we were talking to said, it's up to you to earn the commute. And I thought that was a great way to frame out what it is that we're actually trying to do. We're trying to earn the fact that people want to come to our office and work. And that extends beyond just a hybrid workforce. I think for the most part, everybody on the call, we're in a hybrid work mode now forever. Right. It's going to be rare that the expectation is going to be 5 days a week and we're going to go back to the way that we worked before. So hybrid's here to stay. That seems to be table stakes. And now it's up to us to create an environment that people want to come work within. And so a lot of that is not only the facility and utilizing the on-site resources to make sure that people want to come to the office. It's the culture that you build, and culture really touches on the diversity piece, a lot of the conversation from before, actually, and building that into the actual practice of your organization. Was fortunate to be at the AGM for the CME. I thought another really interesting thing that came out of one of the panels there was one of the manufacturers out of Winnipeg looks at their manufacturing processes and makes sure from the start they're designed to be gender agnostic. Anyone can come in and work on the manufacturing floor and do every one of the processes required to put a window together. And I thought that was fantastic to hear other people working to do those things, because it's one thing to say we are encouraging of diversity, and it's another thing to take actions to actually support that and bring that in, and then they really start to snowball. So we do a lot of that when we're building our culture. We are very strong advocates for diversity of opinion, diversity of background coming into our business around, a lot of it is around finding the best solution, finding the best problem or best solution to the problem, finding various perspectives, but then also driving into activities and actions like that support it under the overall midst of what I really like of earning the commute, or earning the fact that people want to come work for you.
And it's interesting because manufacturing, our clients in manufacturing, they were open, obviously, completely through COVID the whole time. They never got to shut down. And so when we talk about hybrid, sometimes people think, oh, that doesn't really fully apply to us in manufacturing, because, we have people, but obviously there's a lot of rules involved in manufacturing. And we're really wanting to make sure that, there's that, as you said, some people say that's table stakes. Other people say, we've got to figure out how to make that something that everyone, we can accommodate it, and bring everyone into the fold. I'm going to bring the same question. If anyone else, I'll just throw it out to either Kathleen or Sinead, if you have anything you want to add to that around, any really specific examples you have, or some you want to add to what you're doing to attract and retain talent. We heard things earlier in the week, like refer a friend bonus, reframing jobs to make them new and exciting and new industries and new opportunities? What other things are you doing to attract and retain?
So I can chime in on this one. It kind of overlaps with one of the future questions, I know, but one of the programs that we rely on at ProtoCase is what's called the Atlantic Immigration Pilot. And for those of you who may not be familiar, it's more or less a program that works with employers to help us facilitate the PR process for newcomers to Canada who have recently graduated. So we hire a lot of graduates and students, but mostly graduates from Cape Breton University, which is right here in our community, because they have thousands of international students who graduate each year who are struggling to find meaningful work, just based on what their degree is and a variety of other factors. So when we offer that as a sort of pathway to citizenship, it makes us very enticing as an employer. So we love this program. It was actually offered as a pilot, and it's no longer called a pilot program. It's a real program now. So I think it's just called Atlantic Immigration Program. And yeah, so for those of you in the Atlantic region, I highly recommend that you take advantage of that. So that's one thing that we do. We also make significant use of hiring co-op students so that we can make a really good impression on students when they are very young and hungry. And we have kind of, well, not to brag, of course, but we've kind of noticed that now in our area, in the Maritimes, we've developed a bit of reputation. So now students are talking to one another and they're referring each other to our co-op program. And then more often than not, a lot of the students want to stay after they've graduated, and then we offer them a full-time role. So that's been really helpful, specifically in STEM, but also in business. And those are two ways that we do it. So.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll talk about retention in just a moment. Kathleen.
Well, I want to say that we do definitely divide, attract, develop, and retain into three different tracks so that we don't muddy that water, or I guess I'll say it that way.
Yes.
But in terms of attraction, we really had to think about, as the Boeing company, we're this large enterprise, we're international, but how do we show up and what are we doing in Canada in order to, call it expand into the underrepresented groups if we look at this facility in Winnipeg? And so we as the Boeing company are having to make changes in terms of where we advertise, how we advertise, the words that we use to ensure that they're either gender neutral and or I would say use synonyms that are more, I'll say, conducive to underrepresented communities feeling comfortable and confident applying for a position. That and the other, I'll say, two discrete things that we do here in order to ensure that we're attracting, and then I'll say that develop and retain, is we want a diverse workforce in terms of all of the attributes that diversity means. So we ensure that we have, I'll say, whoever's doing the down select, we think about diversity in terms of that particular transaction. We ensure that the panels that we have when we're interviewing someone are diverse. Because we all bring forward all of our past experiences to when we're sitting there reviewing someone's interview, and we want to ensure that we have a 360-degree holistic perspective, because there have been times where people have taken a chance on me in my career, and we want to extend that, kind of pay that forward with everybody as well.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you talking a little bit about biases, because those things do bubble up even when we don't. So having a diverse group on your selection committee, changing how you post your jobs to make sure you're going into underrepresented communities. And we're going to talk about immigration in just a moment. When we're talking about, attracting them, and I love how you broke it up because it's so true. What does it take to get them in the door? Once you get them in the door, making sure you make the right type of selection and you are broadly looking at the talent that's in front of you. And then also, how do you retain them? Because so much work goes into finding this talent. How do we make sure that they stay? And, it's great if co-op students are staying, that says a lot. But we also want to make sure we're investing. And I've heard earlier in the week, doing a lot of leadership development, a lot of more increased communication once you get them on board. I think someone earlier this week said he had 100 fireside chats in this past year, a lot of communication. Younger generation specifically was mentioned as a group who want variety in their work. So they want to be rotated a lot of job shadowing, those type of, apprenticeship programs, mentorship. Those are really what's keeping people once we have them in the door. And so let's talk a little more now about the future of work. Because we talked about today, but Canada expects 25% of the manufacturing workforce to retire by 2023. I think I even saw something on the news a few weeks ago about this. And in CME's recent Women in Manufacturing National Success Forum last year, we talked about how do we reach out to these groups, and like early on, like youth, parents. We're not even talking about high school anymore. We're talking about earlier grades. We know we've been out at colleges and universities, but we're trying to change the misconception overall so that we have a good group of people coming in 10 years, that this isn't the old dirty manufacturing floors, but really these, higher paying, sustainable jobs in this fantastic sector. I loved hearing Della speak again from Estee Lauder Makeup, talking about, their state-of-the-art facility now that they just built in Markham. So we really want to know, and I will start with Kathleen. How do you see we attract the future workforce to the sector? Like, how does your organization, like outside of the attraction we just talked about, but other programs or experiences that you have seen, and maybe even anything else you think the government could be doing to help around the education and curriculum and matching skills?
So it's interesting that earlier this week, I was actually at an industry organization meeting, and a few of the larger manufacturers in Winnipeg were coming together. We asked ourselves this very question. And we kind of were focusing on that high school, but I think you're right in saying that high school is almost too late. How do we create that foundation so that in grade school, so that teachers, guidance counselors, parents can see all the benefits of having a career in manufacturing, whatever your role is. And actually another one of my counterparts in Winnipeg told a story about how someone who came up, was always doing touch labor work in their particular factory, was going to retire at 50. Everything paid off, had just bought a brand new F-150 truck, had all the toys ready to go for retirement.
Oh wow!
Right. I mean, and what a great life manufacturing can afford you. So how do we get that message out early and then show, the students, the kids at that stage, teachers, guidance counselors, what that path is for lots of students to be able to develop the skills through high school and maybe through, doing the local colleges. We have one university or Red River College to develop those skills to really hit the ground running in manufacturing. So as they get out there early and often, I think some of the things that government can do to help support industries, I'll just say, I'm really thirsty for those opportunities. I want to be able to donate, I'll call it donate my time, the time of my organization, to create those connections within, I'll say, the broader community here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, actually. And I've been struggling to find, or we have been struggling to find what those opportunities are for us to actually donate our time. So I feel like that could be an opportunity for government to really kind of step up and help us to essentially give back to the community, to create those relationships so that people can see manufacturing can actually be a really great career.
Such a great response around, just people are there wanting to help. How do we make it easy for people to put themselves forward and do the work? I'll open it up to the others. Anything else to add, Simon or Sinead, around future of work?
I think the only thing that I would add is just to kind of reinforce the point that Kathleen made, that a lot of the things that we do around engagement around manufacturing at the high school level is too late. I think manufacturing as a whole has a very historical brand that resonates with people. And as a community, I think we can help with that, in that any or at least the vast majority of manufacturing that remains here in Canada would classify as advanced manufacturing. More shop floors than not that I get to tour, you're nearly able to eat off the floor. I'm not sure that you would, but you probably could if you wanted to.
Yes.
Which is a very different thing. And then on top of that, manufacturing is a really great place to problem solve. And I think that's another place where it doesn't have the brand that it should. Manufacturing is It's tangible, it's real, it's usually something that you can pick up and hold in your hand and drop, and it makes a noise. And that allows you to apply a number of different disciplines to a business in a real and tangible way. You solve problems every day. They run the gamut of technical and otherwise, and it's a very real way to apply your trade to new and unique problems that exist every day.
Yeah, there's lots to get people excited about. So absolutely. Any other comments? And then I will move on. Okay, well, let's move on to talk a little bit about immigration. And I know that Shanice, you started to say a little bit already about it. I'd love to hear about that program in Atlanta, Canada. So CME believes immigration is the key pillar in labor and skills discussions. We know there's a massive skill gap in Canada, and we're really trying to figure out some of the programs that the government is offering right now and how those are being leveraged, and a kind of a more of a broader question. But how have your organizations, or how have you supported your current needs, your workforce, using some of the programs that are out there? And what else do you believe government can be putting in place around programs to, immigration? We know COVID, it was not, COVID put a real backlog and made it very difficult for the immigration program that was already having challenges before COVID. But it would be interesting to get your take on immigration and your own current workforce and what you're doing. So I'd
love to jump in on that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, because you already started to get our ears perked up on it. Tell us more.
Yeah. So absolutely. So this is one of my my soapbox topics. So I'm happy to continue to speak about it. As I mentioned, the AIP is a huge one for us, and I won't get into too much more detail on that because I think I've covered it pretty well. But one thing I will point out is, as I also mentioned, we do hire a lot of students at the university stage, and so in order to be able to do that, we capitalize on as much government to hire students and recent grads. Now, one of the challenges we face is that in Nova Scotia, CEI, which is Cooperative Education Incentive Funding, is the only funding available to students who are international. So this is really difficult because there are so many other wonderful programs that we use, but it is very limiting to us because we would love to be able to hire more students from our local university, but we struggle because, sorry, I think I might have messed that up. But what challenges us is that CEI allows us to hire co-op students, and they can be international or not international. And then our other big program that we use is SWPP, Student Work Placement Program, I believe it stands for. And it only lets us hire Canadian students. I'm almost positive. Now I'm second guessing.
We're not going to fact check you. Don't worry. We're,
Well, I hope that people are, because it's important. So one of the things that I've struggled with is that CEI, which funds international students, doesn't fund internships. And at Cape Breton University, not most, but a huge percentage of the students are taking part in post-baccalaureate diplomas. And these programs offer an internship. They do not offer a co-op. And so they're completely unfundable unless you go through a really tricky, laborious route of using like a MyTax grant or something like that, which is tremendously difficult for employers, especially if you want to hire, multitudes of students. So I call to government to kind of relax the regulations surrounding those programs so that we have more flexibility, because I also believe that immigration is the future in hiring. And when we are so easily able to fund Canadian-born students, it's so difficult to give equal opportunity, and I hate that. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Well, I'm glad you had an opportunity to share that, because, it's fantastic these programs are out there, and you sound like you're really on top of leveraging as much as you can. But I think we hear across the board. I had a conversation with someone over one of our networking on earlier in the week at the conference, just about how laborious it is, and to do some of the work through immigration was making it incredibly challenging. But we all know that's that's where a lot of the skilled trades are going to be coming from. Kathleen or Simon, anything you can add to immigration and what you're currently doing to leverage programs from the government and other recommendations you'd put forward to CME? Kathleen.
I'll say from our perspective, right now, we're probably in the infancy of better understanding how we can leverage existing programs so that we could help to fulfill future workforce needs. So we're still just kind of collecting information to understand it. And I'll say that's where we as an enterprise, the Boeing company as an enterprise, need to ensure that we don't put cumbersome internal regulations in place that really make it even harder to navigate some of the cumbersome immigration requirements. So we're working at that, but we're very much in the infancy to understand it. Right now, we've been very fortunate that we've been able to source, I'll say, the skills and people that we need in Canada. But we do recognize, to my point earlier, is how do we make that pie bigger?
Yes.
And what pressure needs to be put from industry onto government to either support or to create new pathways in order to expand that pie. But we're in our infancy here.
Excellent. Thank you. And we know with retirements coming up later on and the new generation coming in, we're going to have this perfect storm of how are we going to, make that pie bigger. And we know that immigration will be a part of that. Simon, anything you want to add under immigration?
To be honest, I don't think I have anything to add. That was a very complete answer. Thanks to the
excellent.
fellow panelists.
Thank you. And you know what? And
I just have one more thing, Julie, if that's okay. Sorry,
Yeah,
I thought of something while Kathleen was talking, and something that I want to point out. As you mentioned, the pie, and we want to keep expanding the industry. So in our case, we continue to hire international students and newcomers to Canada, regardless of whether we receive the funding or not, because we're in a position to do so. But what it really hurts is the smaller, up and coming manufacturers who can't without that funding. So I think it's really important to open that up a little bit, especially for smaller companies, so that we can continue to build this industry at this time. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's just continue the conversations, because I do think that it's complicated. It's changing on a daily basis. And if we as an industry, a sector, can help each other navigate some of this, that's one of the best ways I find, even in my own business groups around these areas. So I want to talk a little bit about upskilling, reskilling, apprenticeships. We know that research is showing that over the next decade, 3.1 million Canadian jobs will be disrupted as a country as we move to the net zero economy, on top of automation and AI. The transition will bring potentially up to 400,000 new jobs with all different skills. So, Simon mentioned automation. It's good, for you, you're helping us with that, but there are different skill sets that will be needed. And so one of the questions we have, and I can start with you, Kathleen, is what do you think the Canadian manufacturing industry needs to do to be ready and continue to stay at that competitive edge, knowing that the jobs are really changing and all those things we mentioned will open up new jobs, but will we have what we need to fill those?
I'll say for me, it's a two-prong answer. The first is looking within, and then the second is going to be looking outside. So we have to, as companies, as an industry, get comfortable with having more in-house pathways in order to upskill existing labor that we have. We have to be able to take someone who's coming in and doing, I'm going to say, job A, and move them through various jobs, B, C, D, all the way to get to job Z, which job C may have a considerably higher grade in terms of pay. So, how do we work that internally? So I'll say that's something that we've tried to bring more in-house. So it's kind of look within, so create those pathways inside. But then the other thing I think really needs to be done is, as an industry, we need to engage with universities all across Canada, trade schools all across Canada, and be very clear about what we need, what we're seeing, and define the gap if one exists. I've had a couple conversations with university representatives that are local to Winnipeg over the last month, and they're pretty much just telling me, tell us what you need. Tell us what you need in 5 years, in 10 years, and we are going to create curriculum that moves in that direction. And I think sometimes maybe we don't speak with one voice or find, I always kind of come back to this analogy of vectors, and all of our vectors are kind of skewed a little bit, but there's a lot of alignment that we can get, and we can always kind of get further together. So finding those commonalities, if you looked at another analogy, sorry, Venn diagrams, where do we have the overlap? What should we be telling these schools and universities that we need now for that 5 or 10 years? So I'd say that is one thing we as an industry could do.
Absolutely, changing some curriculum, ensuring, you know, the kids coming through the system now are getting jobs that will fill, that have the skill sets that can fill those roles. We heard from the survey, some of the areas right now that we're challenged with are welders, millwrights, machinists. That's some of those skill sets we know. But as we look forward to some of the newer skills that we'll be looking for around automation and AI, we will need to prepare them for that. And I love what you said about looking within and doing pathways. We call them career ladders in the HR world, or like pathways, and helping people get there. Because when we talk about retention, people want to know when they're coming in, there's so many things I can learn in this company, and they will stay if they feel they're getting that exposure.
Exactly.
I'm going to go across the screen this way now. So Simon.
I just, I was going to jump in and start chatting, Kathleen. I thought that was a wonderful answer, framing it in both in and out. And so just to build on that, when we're looking outwards as a community, I think a lot of the time we as companies can get lost in the what's different, which kind of leads us like this rather than what's the same. And, you know, 80% of the time there's a ton of overlap between manufacturers. And I work in industrial automation. I work across every industry. I'm very fortunate to be able to travel around the world to talk to manufacturers about implementing technology. And I see it everywhere, not just here in Canada. We're a lot more the same than we like to admit. The last 20% is really important. It's what differentiates us. But that 80% and speaking with one voice, Kathleen, I completely agree, could make us very powerful for what we need. And then the second piece, when you look inward, my recommendation, and I do a lot of talking around the implementation of technology. And I think the implementation of technology it's an example for a number of different things. If you need to build a new organizational capability, and whether or not that's the implementation of automation or something to do with tool making or machine building, it doesn't really matter what it is. Try to start. We get very lost in what the end state is sometimes. And I'll give a ridiculous example because it is ridiculous, but you know, you get a lot of people who come in and say, I want to automate everything in my whole factory. You're not going to go from no automation to everything being automated overnight.
Right.
But you got to be willing to get started. So pick whatever that first step might be, the most impactful step, the most impactful process, a portion of your facility to start building the capability, because it's the only way that you'll ever get there. So you need to be willing to invest the time, the dollars, the person, whatever it is, to pick up some inertia and some momentum to get to where you want to go. And so don't try to eat the elephant one bite. Take one bite. Get started.
It is definitely a journey. And Shonid, tell me.
So my answer presents a bit of a catch-22. So as you mentioned, right now, I know a lot of companies are struggling to hire welders, millwrights, etc. One way that ProtoCase is trying to jump ahead of that is by not necessarily requiring those skills or those trades in order to fill those roles. And we're doing that by way of giving operators incredibly good work instructions, and by automating as much as we possibly can. And thirdly, by implementing a very, very robust training program so that we can train anyone to do anything. And that's inclusive of, you know, women, people with disabilities, or whatever, it doesn't matter. So anyone can come in off the street, and as long as they have the aptitude and attitude and want to work at ProtoCase, then we will train them. Now, where that leaves us short, unfortunately, is that at the moment, our biggest hiring struggles are in the training and development department. They're in our software department and in our engineering department. So we're trying to, you know, do all of these things. And so now that has shifted our skills gap to these areas rather than at the labor portion of the role. But it does allow us, like, our production staff is roughly half of the people that we employ. So that is sort of our biggest concern. We have to have bodies in those jobs. So we've kind of made do in other departments where the resource need is less significant, just to fill those roles. But we're still struggling with the rest of it. So if anyone has advice, I'm happy to hear it.
And, it's interesting because when we opened up the panel, we talked about, industry specific, region specific. So you can't paint a brush across the whole industry and say the whole industry, this is where the challenges are. These are where the gaps are, because every region's different. Every, sector within the industry is different. And so, I appreciate you sharing that. It's a little different, where you are in Nova Scotia. And it's kind of a two-part question. Then we're going to move to our final area. I want to open it up to some questions as well. There's this piece of the government, again, coming back into this, and best practices you've seen either from the Canadian government or other countries abroad. And many of you are, I think you're even abroad right now. So what are you seeing in other countries that they're doing to help balance the issues around upskilling and reskilling? We know we had the training grant programs coming here in Canada, but anything that you believe the Canadian government can implement in this area to help us in this sector, in this area? And Kathleen, what's Boeing? Have you done anything to get some support in that, or what you're doing? I know you're global, so other things that they may be doing?
Well, about a month ago, I had the opportunity to be in England and saw a presentation from a person who's running our apprenticeship program. And that was really eye-opening for me. The way that it's very formalized, the way that it creates, I'll say, pathways for young people to have a highly skilled, highly trained job when they exit that. And kind of all of the support and structure that goes around in creating a successful apprenticeship. And I just thought to myself, I want that here. I want that for my organization. I want that for the greater community, this manufacturing industry. For me, I think that that's one of the levers that we could pull. And, the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. If we increase, I'll say that those highly skilled, trained people within the industry in general, it benefits us. We're in an ecosystem that we survive by, each of us kind of coming together and doing our part within that ecosystem. So I think that was an opportunity. And I was really jealous, I'll say, of that particular skill and how they have these cohorts that over time graduate and kind of then they come into the business and they're so energized and they're so thankful for their apprenticeship, and they really, they pay it forward year over year over year. We see the benefits of that program in the Boeing company that's operating in England.
And I think to build off what Shawnee had said about the structure for training, and that you're documenting everything and everything's very structured, and the pathways again are documented. So whether you can find someone to help you create that training, or you're putting these programs together so that the people know their journey, and it sounds very meticulous around that, but then you have invested in that, and as you said, they stay and they feel well trained and in some ways indebted to what you've invested in them. Simon, any comment on that one? Any final?
Yeah, my comment here, and I don't know, I at least have a dream, I guess.
Okay, well, what's your dream?
I think the Canadian government should really focus on enabling or incenting private enterprise to be more active in the upskilling, because the vast majority of large companies, this isn't so much for the SMEs, but the vast majority of large companies have some sort of training, onboarding, apprenticeship programs that are really valuable for them. And to the point about 80% overlap would also be very valuable to other people. And so if we could effectively incent that to happen, I think it could serve as a very valuable and short-term solution to one of the upskilling problems, or at least a portion of the upskilling problem.
Absolutely, kind of level the playing ground so everyone gets those opportunities. Thank you. So our last area to explore, we've already touched on it in a number of different ways, but it really, in my mind, deserves its own area of our panel. And that's on, again, the diverse and inclusive work environment. And so creating that diverse and inclusive workplace is really, again, that key to attracting, retaining that untapped potential, those underrepresented groups. So we know, for example, the CME, Women in Manufacturing, is targeting $100,000 100,000, they may make that much too, but 100,000 jobs for women in manufacturing, by 2030. I think it was mentioned earlier, they put together a gender inclusive diversity toolkit. So we're really trying to continue the conversation and never stop it, just constantly be talking about diversity, inclusion in the workplace. And so, Kathleen, I'm going to start with you. So how does your organization create a diverse and inclusive workplace environment? We heard some really interesting ideas earlier from Helena, what she was doing at CAE. If you can, and then any other learnings, experiences, best practices to help create that diverse and inclusive work environment.
I was really pleased to be able to reflect on what Boeing is doing, what Helene shared, and kind of be like, okay, are we checking that box? Are we doing it or not? And one of the areas that we do have a lot of commonalities, we do have, we call them BRGs here, business resource groups, but they are people who have an affinity for whatever it is. It could be cultural, it could be, I'll say, any element of diversity. I won't go down that path. There we go. And so we do have those here. But one of the things I'll say in terms of how we're creating a diverse and inclusive workplace at Boeing Canada Winnipeg is we are leaning into it. So one of the elements that we've been working on over the last 2 years is the Truth and Reconciliation, the 94 calls to action, and specifically number 92, which is about industry supporting education. And so we actually have looked at what are the called local resources that we could bring in and create kind of a speaker session. So we had the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. One of their speakers, Dennis Whitebird, came on to site, and he was able to share his personal experiences so we could learn from it. We've also partnered with a local, I'll call it Indigenous company, to provide awareness training. And this is a 4-hour investment for every single employee here. And so we are really demonstrating our commitment to creating a diverse and inclusive workplace here at BCW by making this investment. So I think people start to see that. They start to see that it's not just lip service. We're not just putting something up on a board saying, hey, diversity and inclusion, but hey, we're going to create that space. Now, what we found is when we've made that investment, other communities have come forward and said, wait a second, okay, you're doing this. What if we could do this in addition to it? How can we show up? How can we contribute more? How can we be a better part, better integrated, into the culture of this particular facility? And so, we're seeing I'll call it the ripple effects of making those investments. So I think it's got to be very specific. Unfortunately, time is money and money talks. And so there has to be some time investment in it. That's just one example. And we've got other things associated with, women in manufacturing to ensure that there are, I'll say, people feel as if there's a pathway for them. I'll say I'm very fortunate. I'm the 3rd female GM of Boeing Canada Winnipeg. And so there's been that idea of people can see people who look like me in those roles, but we need to then, I would say, leverage our teammates who feel comfortable going out and sharing with other people that, hey, this is who I am. This is my elements of diversity, and I'm in this role. You can be in this role too. So trying to create that networking opportunity. So those are a couple things that we're doing.
That's great. And I love, it's really walking the talk, right? So that you're putting the money behind it. It's not just something you posted on your website. And I think awareness is another huge part of all of this area, is that if we don't raise awareness, they can't become a part of the conversation because they don't know how to have the conversation. And one of the things we've learned throughout all of this is that, sometimes people say nothing, which isn't what we want. We want people to feel like we've educated them, they're aware, so they can get in on the conversations that we need to have about diversity and inclusion. And we heard that, boards are talking about it more today than they ever did before, but we have so much more work to do. And so I very much appreciate Boeing helping provide that to people.
I'll say there's one more thing I just want to add real quick, but it's a very Winnipeg example. But I view a lack of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's like if you walk by a door in the winter and you feel the cold air coming in. Right. It's a loss of energy. And you would go and you would address that weather stripping in your door. When it's minus 30 here, you're not going to stand for that very long. And we need to think about our businesses in that way, that it's a loss for us if we don't go and address it and make our workplaces more inclusive and more diverse.
Thank you. Shonit, what's your take on this?
So that was a wonderful answer from Kathleen. So I don't have too much more to add, but what I will say is we're in a position now at ProtoCase where we haven't really formalized any gender inclusive measures, but we're at a point in our growth where it makes sense to do it now because we haven't had any issues with that. Obviously, I'm in senior management, and when I look around the table in our management team, more than half of the team is female. There's a wide variety of different cultures present. We have the vast majority of our team is under the age of 40. And then, we kind of take it for granted. So it's like we haven't had any issues with this until now. So it would be a great time to implement something to formalize it and make it a little bit more stable as we progress and continue to hire more people. So I think it's extremely important. And I don't like to come to the panel and say that we don't have any real measures in place at this moment, but it is definitely on our radar. And I also would like to echo the importance, as Kathleen mentioned, of the mentorship and networking component, because that has also been something that has benefited me tremendously. I didn't even think I should apply to my role at ProtoCase originally because I looked at it and I thought, oh, I'm not qualified. And I had a mentor at my previous job who looked at me. She was about 10 years older than me and said, yeah, no one is qualified. That's such a niche role. Like, you should apply. Like, don't sell yourself short. So I did, and I ended up getting it. So you need someone in your corner, and you have to remember that now that, well, I have to remember that now that I'm here in this position, I have a duty to now bring other women and other, people up to the table. So.
Absolutely. And I know for Max People, when we've explored this, it is a lot around mentorship and helping bring people along in communities and areas where they don't have those opportunities. It can't be because you're well networked that's why you're getting these experiences. And we want to, tap on the shoulders and help others and bring other people along. So that is a great piece. I'm going to ask Simon, and I think it's good. We're all on a different area of this journey, right? So I think transparency and authenticity is really important. We all try to pretend we're doing everything. Then, we want to be honest that, we're all on this journey at different stages, and similar, like she said about ESG, right? So Simon, anything you want to add about what ETS is doing in this area?
So two things from our perspective. I'm a big believer that a lot of diversity and inclusion comes back to your culture. And so I've been in this role for just about 5 years now. And one of the things that we really focused on was creating a culture of openness and acceptance. And what that's really done, not just for the diverse team members, but it's given a opportunity and an acceptance, I guess, for people to try and potentially fail. And failing is okay as long as we fail once and we learn and we don't make the same mistake a second time. And that's been a really key enabler for our business as a whole to grow at the rate that it has. And we've been fortunate to have good success over the last little bit. The other thing that we did was maybe more deliberate to diversity and inclusion is when I joined, the leadership team was 100% men. And today I'm very happy to say that we're 50-50. Wow. And what we did was we began by being deliberate about developing high potential middle management females within our team. And that has vastly exceeded, I would think, anybody's expectation for the rate of growth inside of our team. And then building on something Sinead said, I think what we didn't really anticipate was once somebody's in that position, then they're helpful to others that are in that position. And it's really created and had more impact to our culture of diversity and inclusion than I think we thought from at least 5 years ago. Yeah. And it's been really great. I don't know that I would have been able to articulate that particularly well, but I will steal Kathleen's analogy that we have a lot more energy today than we had before. We're not leaking air anymore. And I think that's a big reason why, because we deliberately developed some really high potential women in our team. and the impact has been palatable and awesome.
Thank you. Well, we know diversity, equity, and inclusion it's good for people, but it's good for business, it's good for people, it's good for everybody. So you have people sitting in your organizations who have a tremendous amount of talent, who need to be grown from within, and they may not be being seen, especially in a marketplace. We know it's extremely hard to find talent. We talked a lot about what we're doing to try to bring talent into our organizations. And in the previous fireside chat, we heard about doing talent reviews. Max People, we've spent a lot of time with our clients doing that, really looking at who's here and where are they sitting and how we're going to move people up. And he talked about, training paths and career pathing and mentorship and coaching, like all of those things to, if you have a manager who's struggling, I'm going to put one plug in around leadership development and training is and we talked about this over the dinner on the first night of the CME conference, was really about the importance of investing in your mid-level leaders. They are the ones who are leading and guiding and giving the feedback and growing. And if you want to keep your talent, those leaders and managers really have to be groomed well, because we know that if people are not happy, they are leaving quite quickly. And so we want to make sure we keep people. So while you're looking and doing your talent reviews and trying to grow people from all different representation, both bringing them in and grow them, make sure that your people have been skilled on how to have these difficult conversations. I love what Kathleen was talking about. It's like awareness. How do you have these conversations? Some of them are sensitive and people are just not having them because they're just too nervous to have them. And then the conversations aren't happening. So again, coming back to why we are all here today, and I really want to open it up to questions and thank our participants both for joining as well as our panelists for being here. But when we're looking at addressing the labor and skill shortages, looking at the survey results, there's a lot of work to be done by organizations, by government, by leaders, and I'm really excited and feel like we are in a good place because the conversations are happening and people are sharing a lot more than I feel they ever did before. So I'm going to pass it back to, Dennis is going to close off the entire thing, but we have time now for Q&A. So what I noticed in the Q&A, and please use the Q&A, we will be looking at those, but right now, if people can see that, there is some information that was given in the Q&A around the YWCA program, advanced. So that was originally someone had posted that in the Q&A so that if people wanted to know, and as I said, sharing programs that are out there would be very helpful. Are there any questions specific or something else that we didn't cover off that the panelists would like to add? And then we'll pass it back to Dennis.
There were 2 questions asked in the Q&A. I typed the response to them and they went away, which I didn't realize was going to happen. So Kathleen or Sinead, if you want to jump in on either one.
It looked like the first one was, do you measure retention and attrition? Do you do exit interviews of all the leavers? And what are your most successful retention strategies? I'll say we definitely measure retention and attrition. It gives us, unfortunately, it's a lagging indicator of how we're performing, but it is a data set that allows us to judge, how we're performing as a total organization. We don't perform exit interviews with everyone. We do perform them if I would say probably it's up 50% of the time, especially if someone caught us off guard. To be like, whoa, wait a second, this person is leaving. We thought we were making that investment. We thought there was a development plan. We thought there was a future for that individual with BCW. Why are they leaving? And we do try to collect as much of that information. I will say, that's part of us ensuring that whoever's performing that exit interview, typically we have at least 2 of the leadership team, because I tell you what, I hear something and I put it through my own filters. And, I come forward with all of my biases. And so I need to, we try to kind of use that triangulation type theory. And so in terms of what most successful retention strategies, I would say that the biggest one that we have is engagement in terms of retention. So how do we create the culture? How do we make people feel valued here? And a lot of it that we found, especially since COVID-19 caused us to have to kind of go into our shells and not have lots of I'll call it quality time with each other. We've restarted that and very, very focused on engagement. How do people feel appreciated, on some sort of normal cadence that they're here? How do we create those fun, maybe totally non-work related activities that they can create relationships with their coworkers, maybe in their function or outside of their function. So it really feels like a community, so that we can kind of strengthen that organizational fiber. So I'll answer that way.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, people want to feel appreciated. They want to be seen. They want to have relationships with their managers. If you look at any of the Gallup and engagement surveys, or you read any of the work done by Marcus Buckingham on love and work, people want to come to work. And we don't have time to talk about the quiet quitting topic, but the point is that people overall want to find passion in their work. They want to find purpose. They want to be seen. And that goes a tremendously long way. And the other point I'm going to add is we talked about exit interviews. There's also something called stay interviews, which is you're asking people like, what keeps you here? You know, we want to do more of what keeps you here and doing those. I'm going to give Simon and Shani just one more final thought comment you want to make, and then we will close it up and pass it back to Dennis.
So on the stay interview, that's an interesting way to put it. We have a similar method that we utilize. It's a quarterly survey that is done through Bamboo HR. It's absolutely anonymous, and we ask all of our employees usually between 1 and 3 questions about basically getting at the root of why they are or aren't happy here. And then we have each manager gets their, data, and we disseminate what our plan to fix is with the team. And then that helps us, it gives us a lot of insight, because we also track retention. And but this has been one of the better things that we've been able to do, because it helps us get ahead of it before we end up at the exit interview stage. So.
And I love that you're doing it quarterly, you're not doing it annually, because sometimes by the end of the year, it's a little too late.
Yeah, and we don't want to do it any more often than that, because then people get annoyed.
And they want to see that if you're asking the questions, what are you going to do about it? And you mentioned it goes back to the managers. The managers know, don't take time doing engagement surveys if you're not going to do anything with the feedback you get, because that makes people more irritated, and engagement really starts to take a dip. Simon, final thoughts?
I think the only thing that I would add is I would encourage those on the call to, especially with your high potential team members or those that are really looking to grow, write down their development plan. It's one thing to talk about it, and it's another thing to write it down. And it doesn't have to be a big, long document. It doesn't have to be super formal, but even having a written down plan that you can hold the team member accountable to, because they're a part of it, and you can hold yourself accountable to, I have found has made a major difference in the retention of our team members, because they see that there is actual action in the development of their career. And
Absolutely.
It's really important to write it down in some format, not just talk about it.
I agree. And also when we talk about promotions and pathways and growth, if someone and you mentioned, I never thought I could have a job like that, or I didn't know I had those skill sets. But if someone says to you, here's where you are here, and this is the gap, and we're going to get you there, and here's the way we're going to get you there. And so it's a very, again, methodical or thoughtful way of how we're going to get you there. And that really inspires and keeps the energy there for the employee to say, I'm talking to my manager, I've got a development plan written down, and I know I can move to that role in 6 months, 12 months. And it's there, and it allows them to see that it's not we're just talking about it, but it's written down. So absolutely.
Exactly, Julie.
So thank you for that. And thank you all of you for taking your time today and sharing the knowledge of what's going on in each of your businesses, because the practical real world things that you're doing is what I know we were all looking for. So thanks again, and I'll pass it back to you, Dennis.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Julie, and let me thank this panel. This is incredible, both this panel and the discussion earlier with Hélène, because what we learned today, or what I learned, and and even old people can learn new things, is that ESG is good business. And what I mean is, by looking at these principles are how we are going to succeed in the future, and it's good business. High levels of retention, developing strong performers, having a diverse workforce, taking advantage of people's skills and really engaging your workforce is what we've been talking about today. Yes, we're going to continue to have trouble with shortages of labor across Canada. We're going to, we know that we have a number of things that, CME works on that are macro things around changing the immigration system and trying to reduce backlog. But what can we do to help upskill and retain our employees, and how do we track more? It's exactly, perfect way to end a week that started with us talking about labor shortages, and oh my goodness, what are we going to do about it? And it's just a fantastic end. So thank you very much for your insights, and boy, I hope our members took notes, but there so much to take away. I'd like to thank everybody across Canada who joined us this week. It was an incredibly rich curriculum, I think I want to call it that, conference. I want to thank our sponsors, BDO, RBC, KPMG, People Corporation. Yes, they're on the screen again. Max People, of course. Thank you, Julie. Salesforce, Encore Advisors, and Marks for their support. This may be the end of our conference, but as you know, because of the work CME does in your province, wherever you happen to be, it's not the end of the discussions. We have lots of work to do together. We're here on your behalf. We're here. This is a member-driven organization. We do things because our members need them, and because it's our mission to try to help manufacturers succeed. So please do not hesitate to reach out to anyone at CME. We want to help you grow your business. We want to help you succeed. And if you need assistance about any of our programs, any of our training, our partners, please. We're here for you. So thank you so very much. Until the next time we're together, take care, have a great weekend, and I hope everyone stays safe and look forward to the next CME event. So bye for now.